I love what you're saying is about how to increase the literacy around eating disorders. And I think we've talked about patients and their families, we talked about payers, but there's a third group that really we hope can increase education, and that is providers. So right now, if you go to a pediatrician and you are a 15 to 25-year-old thin, white, middle to upper middle class, young cisgendered female, you might get diagnosed with an eating disorder. But if you're a male, they're probably not going to catch it in you. And what a lot of providers don't know is that up to 40% of people with eating disorders are male. We know that eating disorders affect people equally of all races and ethnicities. We know that eating disorders affect people who are trans at a higher rate than cisgendered individuals. And so there's a lot of people who also average weight bodies. Most people with eating disorders are in average weight bodies. You can't tell by looking at them. So I think one of the, we've had a lot of focus on payer advocacy and payer policy changes. And I think there's a real need for some policy changes and literacy around providers that start during education, so medical school education. Also, there's a lot of people that are graduating from school as therapists who've been taught non-evidence-based treatment for a bunch of different illnesses that don't know how to adequately diagnose or treat an eating disorder and other mental health illnesses as well.
Think that still so much of our stigma on eating disorders and substance abuse really is that we blame the patients tremendously. And we still think that you chose to do this, you can choose to get out of it, and this is your fault. There's not a lot of empathy there. And if we can really educate around, no, this is the same thing as if you had, cancer or diabetes. It's the same thing as a medical illness. You had a genetic predisposition. It was, your brain-based illness. It's not your fault at all. And guess what? There are evidence-based treatments. And I remember even in my own recovery, oh my goodness, how comforting to hear that this wasn't a personal defect and a personal failing, but this is just like a way that my brain works. And frankly, that helps for recovery. Certainly in our treatment, we utilize our understanding of the temperament traits that enable you to be vulnerable to an eating disorder and do a lot of education around how you can actually use those to go on and be really productive in life. P.S. I think I'm a pretty good example of that, of channeling some of the type A perfectionism and anxiety into being really productive. But it's also just it's a much less stigmatizing way to view the illness, and a much more hopeful one at that. And when I talk to patients and families about the brain basis of this illness, there's a huge relief and a huge okay, we get it. There's a reason for this. And also we can use that knowledge to our advantage to beat these illnesses.
I really love this move towards brain plasticity and the literacy around being able to rewire your brain at any age, and that you can take your old default mode of acting and behaving and change it. And it kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier. You've got to drive through the immediate feelings and get to the actions. And then ultimately the feelings start to change and your reinforcement changes and your actions change. But, we really are bereft of any kind of literacy around any of this. Looking at Equip and looking at what you do, it's the family-based approach is really left out of most other mental health solutions as well. So it's the literacy and the training not keeping pace with what is the evidence base is a striking characteristic across the board of mental health and addiction. It's starting to change, and it's good to see that it's finally changing, but I think we still got some ways to go before we can kind of get the public to understand this in the way that they need to.
And just to say, this as a person in recovery, but how hard for the patient, right? It often takes everything you have to muster the courage to reach out for help. And if you're told once, right, that you're not sick enough. We hear this all the time with people. The majority of eating disorder sufferers are in average weight or higher weight bodies. And providers will, literally say to them, oh, you don't have an eating disorder. You could lose 20 more pounds when they've been doing the exact same behaviors that somebody in a smaller body has been doing that landed them in the hospital. that, I mean, I know so many people who've heard one instance of that and been turned off on help seeking for years and years and years. Imagine receiving that time and again and again and again. How many people are just going to say, you're right, I'm not sick enough, this is my fault, and I'm never going to try to seek treatment again? It's really horrifying.